welcome back and thanks for joining us today as we continue in our 4-week study from the Smith and Hellways Formation Series, Jesus and the Spirit. We talked last week about the difficulty we have understanding the Spirit, particularly when you compare our understanding of God and Jesus. Those are a little bit easier for us to draw a mental picture of, but when it comes to the Holy Spirit, there's a certain amount of mystery that goes along. And so this month, we'll be taking a look at each of the Gospels, looking at some of the things that Jesus said to his disciples when explaining the Holy Spirit to them. This week, we're going to be talking about how the Spirit reveals Christ to us. And the setting, we're in John chapter 14, and the setting is the upper room, Jesus explaining to the disciples that he's getting ready to leave them, but that he will return to them. And they're having a very difficult time understanding this. You know, as I read through those first few verses of chapter 14 and some of the questions asked by Thomas and Philip, I have the same questions. This is very difficult to understand at times when we try to understand the meaning behind some of Jesus's words. We pick up in verse 15, if you love me, you will keep my commandments. And that's the first point about how the Spirit reveals Christ to us. It starts with keeping Jesus' commandments. So what are the commandments of Jesus? Well, as we read through the Gospels, he had many commandments. But perhaps the greatest commandment that we all, understand and know from Matthew chapter 22 is to love God and to love each other. And so that was the greatest commandment, was to love God and to love our neighbors ourselves. And so everything else works under that. But Jesus had many teachings. And so the idea that we study the Bible to understand these teachings of Jesus, and then when we intentionally make the decision to follow these teachings, that opens us up to the revelations of God through the Spirit in our lives. So you'll see that repeated through these focal verses today, at least 3 different times where Jesus refers back to keeping commandments, being obedient. He also says, if you love me. So the motivation behind keeping these commandments is not as the Pharisees and the Sadducees, the kind of the legalism of formal religion in that day. It's the motivation is love, because we're loved. Out of love, we're going to follow love of Jesus. We agree to follow his commandments. So that's where it all starts for us, is if we love him, we'll follow his commandments. Now in verse 16, and I will ask the Father, and he will give you another advocate to be with you forever. Here we have Jesus saying that because they love him, he is going to ask the Father to send in a replacement player, somebody who can step in his absence. Jesus has already told the disciples, I'm getting ready to leave you, but I will return. Well, we know he returned post-resurrection, and we know that eventually Jesus will return in the second coming, but he wanted to let them know, I'm not going to leave you alone. I'm going to ask the Father to send somebody to come in my place. He says, I'll give you another advocate. In other words, another of the same kind, meaning Jesus is already our advocate. The Holy Spirit will be as well. Now, that word advocate comes from a Greek word, parakleos, which means called alongside. And so with the Holy Spirit, what we have is this advocate, this one that's been called to walk alongside us, to guide us, to mentor us, to keep us on the straight and narrow, to nudge us in the right direction. That's the Holy Spirit, another advocate. And he says to be with us forever. Now in verse 17, Jesus begins a series of comparisons between the disciples and what they seek, which is God's kingdom, and what the world seeks. And when you hear the reference to the world, what we're referring to is the things of this world, the things that our human natures tend to seek naturally, that are in opposition to those things of the kingdom. And he goes on to say in verse 17, this is the Spirit of truth, referring to the Holy Spirit, whom the world cannot receive because it neither sees him nor knows him. You know him because he abides with you and he will be in you. He's making the point here that the Holy Spirit is truth, but we can only see it if we seek things of God's kingdom. And we can only do that if we keep Jesus' commandments. And so we kind of see a connection between all three of these ideas. The world, on the other hand, doesn't seek the things of the kingdom, and therefore they can't understand and experience the Holy Spirit. Now, over in verse 25, Jesus says, I have said these things to you while I'm still with you, but the advocate, the Holy Spirit, whom the Father will send in my name, will teach you everything and remind you of all that I have said to you. So this is the practical part of the revelation. What is it that the Holy Spirit is going to reveal about Christ? I will teach you everything, and I will remind you of all that I have said to you. The disciples had the advantage of having Jesus in their midst, teaching them and also reminding them of what was important. Now Jesus is leaving. The advocate, the Holy Spirit, the replacement player, is going to come in Jesus' stead. And for you and I, years later, that's how the revelation of Jesus comes to us, is through the Holy Spirit. In the two things the Holy Spirit does for us is it teaches us and it reminds us. Finally, in verse 27, peace I leave with you, my peace I give to you. This is Jesus' legacy, is peace to the disciples. He says, I do not give to you as the world gives, meaning it's a different type of peace. The peace of the world is typically considered to be absence of conflict. The peace of Christ is a sense of wholeness regardless of circumstances. It's a sense of confidence and completeness and joy that cannot be achieved through worldly ends. Jesus goes on to say, do not let your hearts be troubled and do not let them be afraid. This peace is designed to overcome fear. Now, Jesus knew what was getting ready to happen. He knew his disciples would be fearful as he gets arrested and crucified, and even in the resurrection. These would be things that would be that would be unsettling for his disciples. And so this legacy of peace he leaves with them is designed to help them so that they don't cower in fear, but with courage they'll be able to go out and spread the gospel to others. Well, for you and I, the same is true. The Holy Spirit reveals himself to us in this sense of peace, the legacy of peace of Christ. So, just in summarizing what we've talked about how the Spirit reveals Christ to us, number one, it starts with keeping Jesus' commandments. If we love him, we'll keep his commandments. The motivation is love, but in the keeping of the commandments, we open ourselves up to experience the Spirit. The Spirit lives within us so that we can know Jesus. 3, the Spirit's purpose is to guide and teach us. And finally, the Spirit brings us the legacy of peace. Well, I hope you have gained some insights this week as you have studied from 14th chapter of John. I hope you will continue to join us as we have 2 more weeks in this study. Be with us again next week. Until then, I hope you have a great week. God bless you, and we'll see you next time.